Colleagues, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call to order this meeting. Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon and good evening. Welcome back to the formal virtual session of the third meeting of the Subsidiary Body on Implementation. Today is the first day of our second block of plenaries. We will consider the following agenda items. Agenda item 11 on mainstreaming of biodiversity within and across sectors and other strategic actions to enhance implementation. Agenda item 5 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Agenda item 12 on specialized international access and benefit sharing instruments in the context of Article 4, Paragraph 4 of the Nagoya Protocol. Agenda item 13 on Global Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism, Article 10 of the Nagoya Protocol. I would like to remind you that if technical issues arise, please use the green question mark in the bottom right corner of the meeting home page to request technical assistance. Before we begin, I would like to invite the Secretariat to provide some information of organizational work for these sessions, followed by some logistical information on the use of our online meeting system. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Good day to all our colleagues out there. As you already know, to join all plenary sessions, you must connect through the SBI homepage on the Cbd website. From the calendar, click Join the Meeting, select the session you wish to attend, followed by the type of connection you need for the session, whether it is speaker or viewer. We ask you not to save the interactive link into your browser, as plenaries and contact groups are different meetings, but instead to join the meeting from the SBI homepage. As you have been informed through the scenario note, plenary sessions will be recorded and streamed online. Statements submitted in writing will be posted online unless the Secretariat is informed otherwise. Delegates are asked to use the online application to upload statements. Please do so prior to delivery in plenary. It greatly facilitates the work of the interpreters if you can upload your statements in advance. However, they will be posted on the website only after delivery. You can also use statements at cbd.int to send statements in case you are unable to use the online application to upload statements. In any case, statements as well as any associated recommendations for text changes must be posted within 12 hours of the closure of an agenda item if they are to be considered in the future work of the body on that item. Uploading instructions were included in your priority pass email, along with your dedicated link, which leads you directly to the upload page. All plenary sessions will last 3 hours per day and will be held from 7 to 10 a.m. Montreal time, with a 15-minute break approximately midway through each session. Please note that plenary sessions will become active for you to connect 90 minutes before start time, and the Secretariat will provide technical training and testing 60 minutes before the start. If you are going to speak on a particular day, it is recommended that you test your system in advance of the start of the meeting. Requests for the floor by parties will be heard for each agenda item Statements by other governments, stakeholder groups, or other observers will also be heard as time allows. Statements on each agenda will be limited to 5 minutes for regions and 3 minutes for individual parties. For major stakeholders, each statement is limited to 4 minutes and other observers to 2 minutes as time allows. A clock is provided for you on the screen to help you manage your time. Please remember that as you speak, your interventions in plenary are being translated into 5 other UN languages by a dedicated team of interpreters. In order to facilitate their challenging work and make sure that we can all understand each other, please keep the following in mind. Despite the time limit on your interventions, do not race. Read at a pace that allows interpreters to follow you. Keep background noise to a minimum. You can do this by wearing noise-canceling headset and microphone sets. Check your sound using your own voice before joining the session. Upload your statements before delivery rather than after. If any speaker encounters connectivity issues that prevent them from making their statements, they should contact the Secretariat to make alternative arrangements. Regarding the use of the online system, when the chair opens the floor for interventions, if you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list visible to the chair. When the chair gives you the floor, the moderator will activate your microphone and the status bar will turn red on your computer. Please wait a few seconds after the status bar turns red and then start speaking. In the event that the chair gives you the floor to speak and you have not raised your hand, please press the raise hand button so the moderator can see you on the list and activate your microphone, turning the status bar to red and enabling you to speak. We would also like to remind participants that the chat box is for brief communication, mainly regarding any need for technical support, and therefore to keep your remarks there short. The time for statements is limited. A clock is provided for you on the screen to help you to manage your time, but please do not speed up your reading, as it will be challenging for interpreters to follow you. Please note that towards the mid-session, the chair will announce a 15-minute break. There is no need to log off during this time. Finally, we remind you that a virtual display table is at your disposal to share publications, information materials, and events that relate to the issues being addressed by SBI-24 and SBI-3. Please click on the tab Virtual Display Table located on the right-hand side of the web portal of the Substar SBI meetings. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Distinguished delegates, I now invite you to consider Agenda Item 11 on mainstreaming of biodiversity within and across sectors and other strategic actions to enhance implementation. Before we proceed with statements, kindly recall that this item was considered during our informal session on March 11 to 12, 2021. At that time, interventions were heard from 22 parties and regional groups and 6 observers with 8 additional written submissions. I will now give the floor to the Secretariat to introduce the documents on this agenda item. Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? To support the deliberations of the subsidiary body on item 11 as related to mainstreaming, the Executive Secretary has prepared document CBD/SBI/3/13 and its addendum, add 1. Document SBI/3/13 summarizes the activities and outputs of the informal advisory group on mainstream, explains the structure of the proposed long-term approach for mainstreaming biodiversity, reports on progress on other elements relevant to this agenda item, and provides draft text of a recommendation for consideration by this meeting of the subsidiary body. Annex 2 presents the proposed long-term approach to mainstreaming. Annex 1 contains recommendations of the informal advisory group on how to strengthen linkages between this approach and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, addressed to the third meeting of the open-ended working group. Document SBI/3/13 add 1 provides elements for an action plan for the proposed long-term approach for mainstreaming, comprising an indicative catalogue of activities for the use of parties and their governments at all levels, economic sectors, rights and stakeholders, and civil society. Information document INF/21 provides a compilation of relevant sources of information related to the action plan. INF/6 offers updates from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN on its contribution to the Convention on this and related items. In addition, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has made a submission for the consideration of the third meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation, also under item 11, related to the engagement of subnational governments, cities and other local authorities and the outcomes of the so-called Edinburgh process, which has been led by the Scottish Government. On the basis of this submission, the Executive Secretary has prepared document CBD/SBI/3/19 that compiles the key elements of this submission, including a draft recommendation prepared by the Scottish Government and partners in the Edinburgh process. Two information documents, numbers 25 and 26, provide additional information on the topic, including a report on the Edinburgh process and the related declaration. Thank you, Mrs. Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. Distinguished delegates, I would now like to invite the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to make an introduction to the submission received from the Minister of State concerning the engagement of subnational governments, cities and other local authorities and the outcomes of the Edinburgh process. United Kingdom, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Distinguished delegates, in addition to the UK statement made at the informal SBI-3 session, I will provide information on document SBI-319 and the draft plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities for biodiversity. The plan of action recommended for consideration by parties builds upon Decision 1022 and 12.9, both of which set out areas for the engagement of subnational and local governments in implementing the previous strategic plan for biodiversity. It will also be essential for parties to actively involve all levels of government in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and the proposed plan of action sets out how this could be achieved for the next decade. The elements set out in the plan recognise the strong role that subnational and local governments play in the implementation of global biodiversity target and highlights areas for collaboration with parties, including harmonisation between levels of government, mainstreaming, resource mobilisation, communication and outreach, and improved monitoring and reporting. Implementation of the plan of action will support the whole of government approach as called for in the post-2020 framework, and the advisory committees for subnational and local governments, as established under Decision 1022, will ensure coherence with other CBD processes, such as the long-term approach to mainstreaming. Many of the aspects of the plan of action call for better collaboration and can be funded out of existing subnational resources. However, the plan also calls for more efficient resource mobilization. In line with Principle 2 of the ecosystem approach, resources should be spent at the level where they can have the most effect. The subnational constituency are also planning how best to jointly approach international funders and donors to support the plan if adopted. Reporting on the plan should be done through national reports, as this will reduce the reporting burden, but it is also envisaged that an interim review of the effectiveness of the plan of action will be presented to SBI-3. The plan of action is supported by the Edinburgh Declaration as set out in INF 25, which sets out the political commitment of subnational authorities to the implementation of the post-2020 framework. To date, this has received 150 signatures or endorsements, and I will attach the list of signatories to my written statement. The Edinburgh Declaration will remain open for signing up to COP15. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, United Kingdom. I now invite delegates to take the floor on Agenda Item 11, Mainstreaming of Biodiversity within and across sectors and other strategic actions to enhance implementation. I will now open the floor to interventions, starting with regional groups, followed by parties, other governments and observers. I encourage you to keep your statement short and concise. And again, before I open the floor for interventions, due to the limited time we have, I would ask those parties and observers that delivered a statement on this item at the informal session to take the floor only in the event that you wish to add something to your previous intervention. In developing the CRP, all the comments and suggestions made in your statements, whether in March or today, will be considered carefully. I will now open the floor for statements from regions. And I start with the African region. I see Morocco. Are you speaking on behalf of African region?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Morocco is taking the floor on behalf of the African group. Africa would like to commend the Secretariat and the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming for the quality of the work they have done, as reflected in documents that were submitted. Africa recognizes that proper implementation of biodiversity mainstreaming facilitates the transformational change needed to achieve the 2050 vision. The Africa Biodiversity Summit, held just prior to COP14, identified the issue of mainstreaming biodiversity into relevant sectors as one of Africa's top efforts have been made by countries in this direction, but mainstreaming remains one of the most challenging areas, Madam Chair. And that is challenging for implementation, including implementation of measures to remove or mitigate harmful incentives and promote positive incentives for biodiversity. Today, Madam Chair, the Africa Group is pleased to see the development of the long-term strategic approach to mainstreaming biodiversity within and across sectors. However, we have a set of observations that we summarize in the following. The long-term strategic approach should cover all sectors that have been identified as high priority by the last two COPs, namely mining, infrastructure, manufacturing, health, but also agriculture, forestry, fisheries, aquaculture, silviculture, etc. Secondly, the implementation of capacity building measures needs to be more detailed than in the current draft action plan. Thirdly, the link is not always clear between the post-2020 framework and the action areas of the draft long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming. For example, milestones specific to the action plan for the long-term approach to mainstreaming are proposed. We suggest a better alignment to prevent overlap by focusing the majority of the mainstreaming mechanisms on the goals and targets of the post-2020 global framework. The implementation of such a strategic approach necessitates calls for the mobilization of the different government actors, but also of private companies and all of civil society with its different components, and naturally calls for sufficient financial resources. Fourthly, a successful long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming, Madam Chair, requires first and foremost full alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals and the development of synergies between the CBD and other MEAs. The proposed approach also requires a long-term communication plan to achieve this timeline. This plan must be aimed at all biodiversity stakeholders and those of other sectors, not forgetting local communities. The African Group supports, Madam Chair, the continuation of the work by the Informal Advisory Group, whose mandate is established in accordance with Decision 14/3. This continuation should aim in particular at, firstly, monitoring and reviewing the post-2020 global biodiversity framework in light of the mainstreaming approach. Secondly, reaching out to a broader group of organizations and partners in order to provide regular updates on the implementation of the long-term strategic approach to biodiversity mainstreaming. And thirdly, monitoring and analyzing progress in implementing the strategic approach and conducting a regular compilation of national experiences in mainstreaming biodiversity within and across sectors. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I wish us all good luck at this session.
On behalf of the African region, the only request from regions I can see is from Portugal, speaking on behalf of EU and its member states. Portugal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair and distinguished delegates. I'm speaking on behalf of the European Union and its member states. This statement builds upon our first reading intervention provided at the occasion of the virtual informal meeting of the subsidiary body on implementation in March 2021. We emphasize the need to recognize mainstreaming as one of the key elements of the GBF to meet the Convention objectives, the 2050 biodiversity vision, and to achieve transformational change. We reiterate that the success of mainstreaming will also depend on effective and efficient synergies with other conventions. Mainstreaming is a cross-cutting issue and requires adequate recognition in the further development of the whole GBF, including its goals and targets. The EU and its member states will submit their proposals to improve Annex 1 on ways to advise the co-chairs to integrate mainstreaming adequately into the post-2020 GBF, and the Annex 2, which is the long-term approach to mainstreaming, on the main document, Cbd SBI-3/13, as well as proposals for improvement of the action plan in written. The EU and its member states also emphasize that Annex 2 still needs some work on indicators and milestones, which should better be linked and harmonized with those of the post-2020 GBF. The EU and its member states stressed the need to reduce or eliminate duplicities and burden to the parties with regards to the review of the implementation of the post-2020 GBF, the LTAM, and its action plan. We further propose to reinforce the LTAM as a guidance tool for parties when working on their NBSAPs, which are the main implementation instruments for the GBF. Mainstreaming biodiversity needs the whole of government and the whole of society, including all sectors and stakeholders. The EU and its member states support that the informal advisory group on mainstreaming of biodiversity could have its mandate reviewed or reinforced, engaging with a broader network of sectoral organizations and initiatives. And by the third meeting of the open-ended working group, this renewed informal advisory group shall present its work on ways to adequately integrate biodiversity mainstreaming into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We also stress that the process of reviewing of the LTAM and its action plan before Open-Ended Working Group 3 must be consistent with the arrangements foreseen for reporting, monitoring, and review of the post-2020 GBF. And regarding the document Cbd SBI-3/19 on the engagement with subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities to enhance implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the EU and its member states share the following views. We support the principles of the Edinburgh process for subnational and local governments on the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We also further support the proposed plan of action to be understood as a flexible framework to be implemented as appropriate and respecting each level of government's competencies. And we recall the need to assure the integration of these principles into the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Therefore, the wording on mainstreaming and subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities should be reviewed all along the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Wishing you best for this session. Madam Chair, thank you very much.
Thank you. Portugal, speaking on behalf of EU and its member states. Since I do not see more requests from regions, we will now move to intervention from parties. I think you know the system by now, but if you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list. When I give you the floor, your microphone will be activated, the status bar will turn red on your computer, and you may start to speak immediately. So I will start to give the floor to, see if I can see. I start to give the floor to Brazil, followed by Mexico and then Canada. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Brazil stresses great importance to the mainstreaming biodiversity as it holds a significant potential to achieve the three objectives of the Convention. Brazil expects the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework to play an essential role in our transition towards more sustainable patterns of consumption and production, recognize the variety of sustainable approaches to mainstreaming in the different national socioeconomic circumstances. My delegation takes this opportunity to thank the Secretariat, the members of the Informal Advisory Group on Mainstreaming of Biodiversity, and the broader network of partners for the documents SBI-3 and SBI-3 Add 1. We recognize the dedicated work of all participants in this exercise. However, Brazil is concerned with the results of that exercise. We regret that this deliverable is not what was requested by the parties at COP14. According to COP Decision 14.3, the goal of the long-term strategic approach should be to establish priorities for action based on scientific evidence and in accordance with the national capacities and circumstances. Furthermore, and as important, the COP decided that the Informal Advisory Group work should be, and I quote, advise on ways to integrate mainstreaming adequately into the post-20 GBF. Instead of identifying cost-effective practices, guidelines, methodologies, experiences, and tools related to biodiversity mainstreaming, the proposals, in particular the action plan, are a complex and overwhelming set of...
Excuse me to interrupt. Could you please slow down a little?
Sure.
Thanks a lot.
Instead of identifying cost-effective practices, guidelines, methodologies, experience, and tools related to biodiversity mainstreaming, the proposals, in particular the action plan, are a complex and overwhelming set of activities, many of which go beyond the mandate of this convention. What is being proposed looks more like an alternate GBF. Since the decision agreed at the COP14 does not refer to an action plan, Brazil cannot agree to it. We reiterate that this proposal contains concepts that have no multilateral agreement and suggested actions that either would go against international norms or prejudice ongoing negotiations. Furthermore, we prefer to dedicate our time and efforts towards the development of an ambitious, balanced, and realistic post-2020 GBF. Regarding the proposed long-term approach into mainstreaming, Brazil could agree to a COP decision that takes note of it if the reference to an action plan are deleted, as well as some actions listed below the paragraph 6 of the Annex 2 of the SBI-3 In particular, Brazil suggests the deletion of specific actions and to limit the approach to 3 strategy areas and 5 action areas. We will submit our proposals in written. Madam Chair, my delegation wants to take this opportunity to stress the primary responsibility for the implementation of the Convention rests with parties. Therefore, the different frameworks, approaches, and action plans to be adopted by parties must be discussed.
Excuse me, Basil, note with time.
We highlight the importance and appreciate the work of the Secretariat of different informal advisory groups. However, we remind that their work is meant to give inputs for informed decisions by parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. I will now continue with Mexico, followed by Canada, and then Japan. Mexico, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On document SBI-3/13, Mexico appreciates the work that has been done by the Informal Advisory Group on the mainstreaming of biodiversity to produce the proposed long-term strategic approach for mainstreaming of biodiversity, the LTAM. We think that this represents a good way forward that will allow us to continue work on this topic. Nevertheless, we reiterate the need to strengthen environmental governance by mainstreaming biodiversity into countries' productive sectors in collaboration with UN agencies and institutions. Thus, Mexico supports the fact that the IAG should continue with its work and suggests that its terms of references should be broadened to form an ATEG that also supports the Secretariat as well as being useful for the COP Bureau and the parties. This group could develop additional guidance for mainstreaming of biodiversity into other sectors and to follow up on the work done during COP 13 and 14. We note that there is a need to generate economic and regulatory incentives to achieve efficient, fair and democratic mainstreaming within and across all levels of government, society and sectors that impact and are beneficial to biodiversity, while respecting free, prior and informed consent of the providers as indicated in the Nagoya Protocol. It is also necessary to recognise, include and strengthen the role of the financial sector as well as the work of subnational governments as part of the solution. Turning to the long-term approach on mainstreaming, we have suggestions to clarify and specify action areas, and we have some indicators to propose related to the participation of subnational governments and promotion of internalisation of positive and negative externalities by sectors. So, on relation to SBI 3/19, we wish to share that our subnational governments have reinforced their commitment to implementing the post-2020 framework, together with the Edinburgh Declaration by means of a joint statement. They are taking on 13 additional commitments adapted to their local context. This will strengthen their contributions to the implementation of the global framework and will increase their participation throughout the process in the construction, implementation, monitoring, assessment and reporting on the framework in coordination with the federal government. This statement will be made publicly in Mexico and before the Government of Scotland and its partners. And we will send in our specific suggestions in writing on the draft recommendations. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mexico. I will now continue with Canada, followed by Japan, and then Malaysia. Canada, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Nous éviterons de...
Thank you, Chair. We will not be repeating our position on the strategic long-term approach for mainstreaming, as we have already made our statement during the informal session. We have several specific positions, additional ones, in order to strengthen the actions and activities that we will be submitting to the Secretary. These are in harmony with our positions as expressed before. We, using documents from the subnational governments, which play a deep role in implementing the CBD objectives. Canada welcomes the Edinburgh process and the leadership of the UK, which has become a champion of this process. We would like to emphasize the importance of the Quebec contribution to the process, as well as its role in the advisory group for the national governments. We support, in general, the recommendation as proposed. Nonetheless, we would like to receive additional information on the separate elements of the action plan and in the Edinburgh Declaration, so that we will be able to inform our participation in the discussions. We would like the COP recommendations to include more details and the stakeholders and multiple parties that will be taking part, as well as the implementation of the Edinburgh process and the post-2020 global framework. We will be submitting these proposals in writing. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Canada. And I will now continue with Japan, followed by Malaysia, and then the Philippines. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Building on our statement presented during the informal virtual session of the SBI-3 in March 2021, Japan would like to add a very brief comment on this item. Considering locality of many biodiversity issues, we believe that implementation of various measures at the subnational and local levels is crucial. Thus, we support the suggested recommendation on CBD/SBI/3/19, including the adoption of the updated plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities for biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you, Japan. It was very good, very brief and concise. I will now continue with Malaysia, followed by the Philippines, and then Indonesia. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished delegates, our intervention is brief as well. Malaysia supports the critical efforts in mainstreaming biodiversity across all key economic sectors. However, Malaysia believes that mainstreaming should represent efforts to integrate biodiversity consideration in all current practices and not a license to conduct business as usual. Madam Chair, given the importance of this agenda, Malaysia would like to support the proposal by Mexico on establishment of an ad hoc technical working group, AHTEC, on mainstreaming biodiversity. We believe that an AHTEC will support and strengthen the work of the existing informal advisory group in coming up with recommendations for the parties. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Malaysia. I will now continue with the Philippines, followed by Indonesia and then China. The Philippines, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Philippines supports the adoption of the long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming provided in Annex 2 to the present decision in recognition of the importance of a long-term strategic approach to biodiversity mainstreaming as a key component of taking effective action against biodiversity decline at all levels. The Philippines recognizes the importance of mainstreaming and its crucial role in the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. For this reason, we propose the establishment of an ad hoc technical expert group on a long-term approach to mainstreaming. We envision this ad hoc technical group to advise the parties, the Bureau, and the Secretariat on the implementation, review, and reporting of the long-term strategic approach to biodiversity mainstreaming. Moreover, this proposed working group would have greater means for convening subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities, the United Nations organizations and programs, civil society, scientific community, academia, as well as indigenous peoples and local communities, civil society organizations, working groups, youth groups, and the private sector. Significantly, given that mainstreaming is an ongoing concern, this ad hoc technical expert group, which would report to SABSTA, would be given a mandate of 2 years, subject to renewal by the COP. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Philippines. And I will now give the floor to Indonesia, followed by China and then Colombia. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Chair, distinguished delegates and colleagues, Indonesia views mainstreaming biodiversity into the policy of sector is a strategic and crucial work, an effort to achieve the objective of the Convention and Sustainable Development Goals. This mainstreaming work needs to be strengthened by sector internally. It further requires a solid coordination and harmonization among cross sectors. Development could be achieved in a complementary, harmonious, and supportive manner without disregarding one aspect from another. Furthermore, to conduct a more holistic mainstreaming biodiversity work into its policy, Indonesia supports for the implementation of the long-term strategic approach through national action, building on the experience of the Global Partnership on Business and Biodiversity and the Global Business Forum on Biodiversity and associated instruments. This work can also be realized through a strong involvement from private sectors through its corporate and environmental social responsibility. Indonesia hopes that this could implement the long-term approach to mainstream its biodiversity as further guidance in implementing the element of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework related to biodiversity mainstreaming. This mainstreaming work and action need to be taken at all levels and across governments, economic sectors, and societies. The implementation of mainstreaming biodiversity conservation in Indonesia have been already undertaken on the program of One Health. This program is manifested by integrating human, animal, and environmental health by related agencies. In this regard, Indonesia as a country which also affected by the global COVID-19 pandemic continues its One Health work to manage and control with a strong mitigation to reducing the risk of zoonosis. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Indonesia. And I will now give the floor to China, followed by Colombia and then Switzerland. China, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On biodiversity mainstreaming, our previous statements at the SBI informal meeting remain valid. We would like to make two additional suggestions. We think that the mainstreaming biodiversity into different sectors and industries is in line with the expectations of all parties. So we support it and we look forward a consensus draft decision from this meeting. Mainstreaming biodiversity is an important cross-cutting issue for the post-2020 GBF. So we have two suggestions. First, the long-term strategic approach should promote equity and the participation of a local population. Secondly, this should integrate the development of green livelihoods into biodiversity conservation, ecological restoration, and addressing impact of climate change. We will submit our written suggestions. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, China. I now give the floor to Colombia, followed by Switzerland and then Uganda. Colombia, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Colombia agradece.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Colombia thanks the Secretariat for the working documents, and we reaffirm our position that we presented at the informal session in March, in particular as regards the need to include the long-term approach, mainstreaming approach, at least in sectors that have already been prioritised in COPs 13 and 14. For example, on page 16 in Spanish of Annex 2, the proposed indicators for Action Area 2 on eliminating and reforming negative incentives are restricted to the agricultural sector, even although there are other sectors that are also priorities for this type of management. Colombia has identified biotechnology's great potential as an opportunity to promote biodiversity mainstreaming and also to generate sustainable economic growth in developing countries, which is why we are suggesting that this topic should also be taken into account. Turning now to the draft recommendation in this document 3/13, Colombia has the following three initial proposals. Firstly, in order to be consistent with the GBF proposals and its monitoring framework, we need to highlight the inclusion of mainstreaming actions in the NBSAPs. Thus, at the end of paragraph 4, we suggest the following inclusion, including these actions in the updated or revised NBSAPs, and decide to include it as an annex to the GBF. Then secondly, in paragraph 7, we suggest the following modifications in keeping with Article 20 of the CBD. Invites all parties, especially donors, as well as relevant organizations and initiatives, the multilateral bank and the private sector to provide financial support to the work of the Informal Advisory Group. Thirdly, in Annex 2, we believe that the indicators defined for Strategy Area 1 could be good headline indicators for Target 13 within the GBF monitoring framework. Likewise, the proposed indicators for Strategy Area 3 would be good headline indicators for Target 14. Now we have comments on paragraphs 6, 8, 13, 15, 17, and the annexes that we will send in writing. Then finally, Madam Chair, Colombia reiterates the importance of the linkage with sub-national governments in the work programme of the CBD, in particular during the negotiating process for the new post-2020 framework, in accordance with the Del Valle de Abura Declaration within the context of the Edinburgh process. However, as the working document came out late for 3/19, we will send in comments in writing, in particular on the suggested recommendations. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Colombia. And I now give the floor to Switzerland, followed by Uganda and then UK. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished colleagues, Switzerland recalls its comments made during the informal SBI meeting in March and would like to focus its intervention on the following 4 points. Firstly, on the strategic approach. Switzerland agrees that a strategic approach for mainstreaming biodiversity is much needed. We would prefer an integration of the strategic approach into the post-2020 framework to give it the visibility and attention it requires, and to assure the concourse of other sectors. Furthermore, Switzerland sees a significant overlap between the strategic approach, the current draft of the post-2020 framework, and the strategic plans adopted by MEAs. Therefore, we suggest to refocus the strategic approach for mainstreaming to make it an approach common to all MEAs. Secondly, the programs of work of the CBD should be revived. In the strategic approach, some mechanisms for promoting mainstreaming are missing. The existing and potential new programs of work of the CBD would be important mainstreaming tools. These operational tools to facilitate implementation of the post-2020 framework should be revitalized and expanded in the light of the new goals and targets. Furthermore, Madam Chair, after adoption of the post-2020 framework, we would recommend to update the present work programs, for example, those on agricultural biodiversity or forest biodiversity and others, and to decide on additional thematic areas if needed. We recommend requesting the Executive Secretary to develop a list of the existing as well as potential new programs of work with potential partners in consideration of document CBD/SBI-3/13 Addendum 1 and the updated zero draft of the post-2020 framework. Thirdly, Switzerland is of the view that the informal advisory group should stop in its current form. If continued, the terms of reference need to be revised. Mainstreaming will require the broadest possible engagement of all actors at all levels of government and society. Therefore, mechanisms established under the CBD need to be enabling and open-ended in nature. Any further work of the Convention on Mainstreaming needs to be open to other ministries and sectors, to interested organizations and MEAs. Therefore, we are questioning the continuation of the informal advisory group in its current form. Finally, Madam Chair, Annex 1 does not provide complete advice to the open-ended working group. We would like to point out that in Annex 1, advice for sections G and I of the post-2020 framework are missing. We are of the view that especially those two sections are important regarding mainstreaming. We have provided specific proposals for changes in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Switzerland. I will now continue with Uganda, followed by UK and Argentina. Uganda, you have the floor.
Afternoon. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Yes. Good day to you all. Good day to you all. Thank you, Madam Chair. In addition to Uganda's statement submitted during the informal sessions in March 2021, Uganda aligns with Morocco on behalf of the African Group and further recognizes that mainstreaming as the apex for setting implementation rolling, and believes that Annex 1 meeting document CBD/SBI1/3/13 must be strengthened by integrating the following recommendations. Focus on the post-2020 GBF goals and targets that parties will agree upon and endorse for implementation. Participatory inclusive mainstreaming mechanism must involve 4 key parts of the society, and these are government, private sector, business institutions, subnational governments, civil society, and other global partners. Consider mainstreaming biodiversity into businesses, financial institutions, decision-making processes, and support the task force on nature-related financial disclosure. And then finally, Madam Chair, mainstreaming mechanism should consider national circumstances, conditions, priorities, and capacities to ensure effective implementation of the post-2020 GBF. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Uganda. I will now give the floor to UK, followed by Argentina and then Ecuador. UK, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Further to our comments at the informal session, we would like to highlight 4 key points and some text suggestions that we will submit in writing. First, the UK's view is that the long-term strategic approach to mainstreaming has a truly critical role to play in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and turning ambition into action. The recently published Ascupta review, commissioned by the UK's Finance Ministry, has highlighted, for example, the critical importance of mainstreaming biodiversity considerations into our economic and financial decision-making processes. And the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is supporting businesses to mainstream nature-related risks into their decisions. But further work is needed to clearly and effectively embed it in the framework to support the achievement of the goals and targets. The UK would welcome an opportunity to submit further comments on the long-term strategic approach to mainstreaming and the action plan ahead of its consideration by the co-chairs at the Open-Ended Working Group 3. We have therefore suggested bracketing the long-term strategic approach to allow time for that process. Second, to highlight the important role of subnational and local governments, as demonstrated through the Edinburgh process, we suggest a further reference to governments at all levels in the decision text. Third, we support the development of commitments concerning the implementation of the long-term approach. We also support the proposals for governments and stakeholders, including the private sector, to report on their activities, including through national reports. This process should be as streamlined as possible and closely aligned with the goals and targets. Fourth, and finally, we support regular reviews of the long-term strategic approach, ensuring it remains consistent with the agreed reporting process for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Non-party stakeholders have an important role in implementing the long-term strategic approach, and further work is needed to enable effective stakeholder reporting, including business and finance sectors. With an updated mandate, the informal advisory group could take this work forward. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, UK. I will now give the floor to Argentina, followed by Ecuador and then South Africa. Argentina, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Argentina considers that mainstreaming of biodiversity within and across different sectors is key to urgently address causes of biodiversity loss. Let us be clear, when we're talking about this subject, we have to realise it is a key topic since biodiversity mainstreaming takes place at the frontier of the legal scope of the Convention on Biodiversity. And that is the context for our suggested modifications to this draft recommendation to the document. First of all, we think it's necessary to remember that mainstreaming of biodiversity should be understood within the context of Article 6b of the Convention. Under this article, it requires that the parties shall integrate as far as possible and as appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs and policies. Secondly, and in line with Article 6b, mainstreaming biodiversity is a task that comes accompanied by economic costs. Therefore, we suggest that we should include a request to the IAG to collect information related to... Can you hear me, Madam Chair? So, collect information related to gaps in funding, technology, and the capacity that is needed to mainstream biodiversity into developing countries. Thirdly, we take note of the advice on how to integrate mainstreaming of biodiversity into the global biodiversity framework contained in Annex 1. We suggest that we should modify the name of the annex to clarify that this represents advice from the informal advisory group and not advice developed by parties. Fourthly, on Annex 2, we believe that many changes need to be made. To mention but a few, within the body of the text, we need to include the different biodiversity values to which reference is made, such as aesthetic, moral, cultural values, etc. Even if calls are made in footnotes, due to the nature of the document, it is very easy to confuse these references with an economic value. Thus, the references to positive incentives need to be accompanied by recognition of the fact that funding will be needed in order to be able to provide these incentives in developing countries. We also think that it's necessary to adjust the reference to healthy and sustainable diets to adjust it to the multilaterally used term of healthy diets. Now, to conclude, given the very full character of the document, it's necessary to avoid that it is just being read as a prescriptive tool or that it would enter into conflict with other processes underway. So we suggest that we should incorporate references to other international obligations, in particular the rules of the WTO, as well as references the need to give priority at national level to sectors where mainstreaming of biodiversity policies are to take place. And we will hand in these changes and others in writing on the annex and also on CBD/3/19 on subnational governments. Thank you very much, Madam.
Thank you, Argentina. I will now give the floor to Ecuador and then to South Africa. Ecuador, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good time of day to all distinguished delegates. Ecuador thanks the Secretariat for its work and also the work of the Informal Advisory Group on developing these documents in order to present progress on mainstreaming of biodiversity within across sectors and other strategic actions to improve its implementation with this long-term approach. We consider that this approach should actually be complementary guidance to the Global Biodiversity Framework post-2020 and should strengthen implementation of the targets and indicators that have been suggested and thus meet the goals up to 2030 and also avoid duplication or confusion. So having said that, we've taken note of the strategic approach described in Annex 2, and we understand that all of the functions of this approach are the sum of the wills of various sectors, and in certain cases, including sustainable advice related to biodiversity, will allow us to effectively deal with the pressures on biodiversity, but this really depends on many external factors. Moreover, we suggest that in paragraphs 1 and 4, instead of saying adopt and welcome, should be replaced by saying take into consideration given the preceding paragraphs. At the same time, we also suggest that under point 7, we should eliminate the part where it says consider the possibility of. Ecuador is committed to this subject, and we recognise the importance of promoting synergies with other sectors and coordinate actions within discussions in other multilateral fora that are seeking to implement all of these different goals and operationalize concrete actions will allow us to implement mainstreaming. So we welcome the initiative that's been carried out by subnational governments through the Edinburgh Declaration. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ecuador. And finally, for my list of parties, I give the floor to South Africa. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize, my camera is not working. South Africa aligns our input with the statement made on behalf of Africa by Morocco. We welcome with appreciation the extensive work undertaken by the Informal Advisory Group on Mainstreaming Biodiversity, noting its importance for facilitating transformative change. South Africa agrees that the integration of biodiversity, ecosystem service, and nature's contribution to people into policies and actions at different levels at various sectors is vital and welcomes the structure of the action plan for long-term approach to mainstreaming biodiversity detailed in Cbd SBI-3/13 Add 1 that addresses these different levels. South Africa stresses that enhancing polycentric government is an important element of effective mainstreaming, as is outlined in the strategy area 1 of the action plan. We strongly support component 1.1.3 that requires implementation of ecosystem or natural capital accounting using the SEEA framework, and suggest that the effectiveness of this approach is monitored via tracking changes to national budget processes and planning, and determining uptake to key infrastructure planning decisions and policy choices of key economic actors, including forestry, mining, and agriculture. Regarding Action 1.1, a missing element from this target is specifying that the terms values refers to multiple values, not just economic values. We suggest that it should be made explicit in the strategy that values include intrinsic, relational, and instrumental values. This draws on the concept of values developed as part of the IPBES values assessment. Effective mainstreaming at all levels requires enhanced focus on building capacity for this work. In order to ensure successful implementation of the Action Plan for Long-Term Approach to Mainstreaming Biodiversity, we recommend the inclusion of specific actions on capacity building under Action Area 1, but request the explicitly actions required to develop capacity for the implementation, capacity for implementation of Action Areas 2 to 5 also be included. As mentioned in our regional statement, we require better alignment with global biodiversity framework, and particularly Target 1, which focuses on spatial planning. We suggest that there's a milestone that will monitor the percentage of each nation's territories that are covered by integrated spatial planning, and also tracks these spatial plans at different scales available at national and subnational levels. And this should be included under Action 1.3.1. South Africa recommends under Action 3.2.5 that the work linked to offsets and compensation mechanisms is included, and that these are put in place as a matter of urgency. There needs to be a milestone under Action 3.2.5. Thank you, Madam Chair. We will supply more detailed comments in writing.
Thank you, South Africa. And yes, I have one more request from parties. I recognize Peru has asked the floor. Peru, you have the floor.
Buenos días, señora presidenta. Muchísimas gracias.
Good day, Madam Chair. Yes, we've asked for the floor. Thank you. Thank you for the documents related to item 11. Madam Chair, our delegation believes that it is urgent to mainstream biodiversity at all levels of government and sectors of society, and also in economic sectors, and also mainstream biodiversity in an appropriate way when it comes to implementing the GBF post-2020 in order to halt biodiversity loss as laid out in the document. Thus, Peru very much welcomes the report from the Informal Advisory Group on the mainstreaming of biodiversity, highlighting the importance of synergies with the SDGs so that we can achieve transformative change and reduce the pronounced rhythm, or pace rather, of biodiversity loss, and also bend the curve in terms of indirect or direct drivers of biodiversity loss. We've got also the recommendations of IPBES to be taken into account. This needs to be based on scientific information, and this will allow us to have effective management. So we've taken note of the results of the 5th forum, the Scientific Policy Forum on Biodiversity, and also the 8th International Conference on Science and Sustainability. Thus, it's necessary to have thematic cross-sectoral programs on biodiversity, including business participants. On the other hand, undertaking efforts on mainstreaming means that there needs to be joint work with the 2030 Agenda and the Rio Convention. So we will have some contributions and modifications to make on strategy area 2 and 3, so that we can have these considered within the declaration. And then on the proposed plan of action for the long-term approach, in document 3/13 add 1, we think it's a priority to ensure that this action plan is implemented in sectors that have the biggest impact and that significantly depend on biodiversity. So, Madam Chair, we reaffirm our support for mainstreaming of biodiversity, and we need to implement this theory of change within the GBF and how we manage wild species related to economic cycles, and also with green infrastructure, in particular in terms of sustainability in cities. And we support also Mexico's statement and Colombia and what South Africa has just said when it comes to a holistic central approach to mainstreaming biodiversity. And we very much support the documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peru. I see no more requests from parties. So I open the floor for other governments. I see no requests from other governments. As I do not have any more requests from parties and other governments, I will now invite organizations to speak, and I will start to take interventions from major groups. And as was the case for parties, I will request those organizations that took the floor during our March informal session to refrain from doing so unless essential to bring new issues to our attention. Rest assured that the statements made in March are available to be taken into account by parties. So we will now see if we have a list of major stakeholder groups. I think first on my list is on behalf of women organizations, NGO Farm. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Cbd Women Caucus. Mainstreaming concerns are important for ensuring that issues related to biodiversity and environmental justice, including gender concerns, are addressed by all actors in society. We want to stress in this regard the importance of state responsibility to ensure that robust frameworks are in place across sectors and departments to secure inclusivity in process and the fair distribution of financial resources for ensuring that mainstreaming doesn't leave anyone behind. In this line, following the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, including its business and human rights gender guidance, is necessary to ensure business responsibility for biodiversity, genetic resources, and ecosystem benefits, and to guarantee the rights to participation, access to information, and to justice. We have some concrete text suggestions on the recommendation to the Conference of the Parties. Paras 3, 4, 5, 6, and 10 should include, besides parties and other governments at all levels, indigenous peoples and local communities, women and youth groups, civil society organizations, businesses, and other relevant stakeholders. With regard to Annex 2, the long-term strategic approach to mainstream biodiversity, we would like to propose in the action area 4A to include the biodiversity risk assessment to read as follows: number of financial institutions, integrating biodiversity risk assessment and opportunities into decision-making. In the action area 5, add gender perspective and cultural relevance to read as follows. Just to add gender perspective and cultural relevance. We have uploaded our statement and look forward to support from parties. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, women. And next on my list for major stakeholders is youth, Global Youth Biodiversity Network. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. Our previous statement on this item during the informal sessions remains valid, and we invite you to revisit those recommendations we make this statement in addition to those remarks. First, we are concerned by the undue focus of the draft recommendation on this item on increased support for the business and finance sector, namely in paragraphs 10, 16, and 17e. Mainstreaming is of paramount importance to achieve the objectives of the Convention and for the success of the post-2020 GBF. We must ensure that this process is not used to provide an opening for greenwashing, that the polluters pay principle is upheld, and that we put in place accountability mechanisms for destructive industries. We believe that there are enough incentives for private sectors to be fully engaged in conservation and sustainable use, and that what is lacking are strong regulatory mechanisms to end unsustainable production and consumption schemes, eliminate harmful subsidies, and stop the chronic human rights violations perpetrated by many in these sectors. Furthermore, we recognize the importance need for mainstreaming across society and the critical roles that indigenous people and local communities, women, youth, and civil society play in mainstreaming. However, we emphasize that the burden for mainstreaming should not fall on those on the ground. Parties have a key responsibility in this regard. To be effective, the LTAM should increase focus on interministerial mainstreaming, which is where the CBD can bring about the most change. Concrete plans for mainstreaming within governments should be created, especially with government sectors dealing with finance, mining, energy, agriculture, forestry, and similar sectors. On Annex 1, we believe that sections on enabling conditions and awareness and uptake will be key to align the LTAM and the GBF, which are missing from this section. On Annex 2, we stress that taking a rights-based approach to mainstreaming will be critical to its success. We have suggestions and language in this regard. In Action 1.3, on integrated spatial planning and management, we propose the addition of the words "and free, prior, and informed consent" to read "respecting the mitigation hierarchy and free, prior, and informed consent." Title of Action Area 3, we propose to add the words "and fair" to read "actively transition towards sustainable and fair technologies and practices." In Action 3.2 and Action 3 Indicator C, we propose to add the words "human rights" so it reads "positive impacts on nature, biodiversity, human rights, and human health." In Action 5.2, we propose the addition of the respect for human rights in environmental policy to the list of actions that governments must ensure. Finally, we suggest to revise the wording on net positive impacts on various paragraphs of the LTAM, since priority should be given to avoiding potential negative impacts on biodiversity and not open the door for offsetting schemes that would allow the continuation of business as usual over exploitation of biodiversity. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Youth. And before I continue to give the floor for major stakeholder groups, I would like to remind parties that you can use the chat to express support to any of the observer statements. So if you can use this opportunity to express your support through the chat. Thanks. I will now continue with the major stakeholder groups, and next on my list is Cbd Alliance. It should be Helena Paul from Econexus. I think so. Who is, NGO Econexus, yes. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. This intervention is delivered on behalf of Cbd Alliance and so gathers a diverse range of views and proposals from civil society. Mainstreaming, as currently discussed within CBD, is very far from what it should mean if we are to genuinely address the loss of ecosystems and the marginalization and destruction of the peoples and cultures closest to them. Instead of trying to give a financial value to biodiversity as natural capital, the global economy must operate within planetary boundaries with no further degradation of ecosystems. However, there is a serious risk that mainstreaming will actually achieve the opposite. One reason is that until now, mainstreaming has only been discussed in small working groups, the Informal Advisory Group, and the Extended Consultative Network. Both include members of powerful finance and business groups and coalitions whose interests are in maintaining the current economic model, but some parties and observers in the groups do not appear to be actively involved. The draft action plan for the LTAM should be discussed at SBI-3, but it seems likely there will not be time to do more than discuss how to take the process forward. The draft recommendation is to continue the current process within IAG and ECN, and to continue to promote, expand, and provide support to the Global Partnership on Business and Biodiversity in order to engage business in the process. This proposal raises concerns about the focus on strengthening business platforms and multi-stakeholder processes, and the implication that business should be engaged rather than regulated.
Excuse me, could you please slow down a little?
Sure.
Thanks.
We do not accept these recommendations, and we think that the discussion should now be taken up by the CBD as a whole. The process as currently going risks helping business and finance avoid the urgent change we need. Instead, we see a bid for corporate capture of policy making and the creation of a serious imbalance in power between rich and poor, and society, business, and finance. I leave out a small section here. Governments should be the main actors in mainstreaming for biodiversity and society, and they must regulate the business and finance sectors at national and international level, taking a whole-of-government approach. We cannot expect business to self-regulate, and voluntary actions with self-certification without governmental verification are unacceptable. IPLC's women, youth, peasant farmers and fisherfolk understand best how to nurture local biodiversity and must be heard and their advice followed. Their rights to the sustainable use of biodiversity and governance of their territories must take precedence over commercial control of lands, waters and forests. The plan makes people responsible for acting on unsustainable consumption rather than the companies profiting from it. So we urgently need a review of the process and whether proposed measures in the mainstreaming action plan can actually address biodiversity destruction. Finally, we reiterate our concerns in relation to virtual negotiations, but participate in good faith in an effort to amplify the voices of the disadvantaged. And we request any party that wishes to support us to do so. Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Cbd Alliance. And finally, on my list of major stakeholders, on behalf of the subnational local governments, IDO ICLAY, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Honourable Chair and distinguished delegates, I address you on behalf of ICLAY, the Advisory Committee on Subnational Governments and Biodiversity, which is coordinated by Regions 4 and the Government of Quebec, the group of leading subnational governments towards the Aichi biodiversity targets, the European Committee of the Regions, and the Edinburgh Process partners. We welcome the United Kingdom statement on document CBD/SBI/3/19 and recognize the support from Mexico, Canada, Japan, Colombia, Ecuador, and more today. In addition to our submission at the informal SBI session, we note that many provincial, state, local, and city governments have biodiversity strategies and action plans in support of their national biodiversity strategy and action plan. The group of leading subnational governments documented their members' efforts in a report which includes practical measures that can contribute to the implementation of the post-2020 framework. Many cities are using the Singapore Index on Cities Biodiversity and signing up to Cities with Nature, and many local and subnational governments have shared their actions as part of the decade on ecosystem restoration, which is starting now. These collective efforts show how national sub-governments' contributions are imperative if we are to achieve the 2030 mission, ensure a just, equitable, and green recovery, and bring about the transformative change that is needed to bring the biodiversity loss. We support the UK statement that implementing the proposed plan of action will support the whole of government approach. We agree that while many aspects of the plan of action can be funded out of existing resources, more efficient resource mobilization is needed to scale out implementation. Collective subnational actions can considerably lessen parties' implementation and reporting burdens. We therefore support the proposal that reporting on the proposed plan of action be through the national reports. Implementation of this proposed plan of action will also support the long-term approach to mainstreaming if adopted, and we welcome the references to subnational and local governments in its key elements. And finally, Madam Chair, we urge parties to optimize the Edinburgh process outcomes by supporting the call for a new decision and updated plan of action to replace Decision 1022. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew Ickley. And I see how many I will now, and that concludes my list for major stakeholder groups. And I will now open the floor for interventions from observers. I see how much time we have before we need to take a break. Secretariat, how much time do we have left?
I think we can take about three observers and then take a break.
Okay. Okay, then I will see here. So I open the floor for interventions from observers, and you have 2 minutes for your statements. And I will see here at my list, and I can start with NGO GFC. I'm going to start with that one. And then I have the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So if I start with NGO GFC, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for allowing us to briefly contribute to this debate on behalf of the Global Forest Coalition, a coalition of 117 indigenous peoples organizations, NGOs and women's groups in 71 different countries. I will be brief. We fully support the comments just made by the Cbd Alliance. We would just like to add that we feel there's a slight confusion about the concept of mainstreaming. Mainstreaming biodiversity might not always have a positive outcome for biodiversity, and as such, it is not always supporting the objectives of the CBD. Mainstreaming can also imply integrating biodiversity into a polluted stream, and we are concerned a lot of biodiversity might not survive this. Mainstreaming itself could mean aligning biodiversity with business as usual, rather than aligning business as usual with biodiversity. For that reason, we feel a more appropriate concept to encompass what many parties seem to strive for is the term alignment. The ultimate objective of the SBI should be to align all regulations, policies, financial flows and incentives with the CBDs, its objectives and its decisions, and its strategic plans, including many existing commitments in the field of human rights, gender justice and social equity. Our first suggestion is thus for parties to consider replacing this ambiguous term mainstreaming with alignment so that there can be no confusion about the ultimate objective of this line of work. Secondly, we also strongly support the recommendation to discontinue the informal advisory group and its extended consultative network. We would like to add that while we appreciate the hard work of the members of these bodies so far, there is simply no logic rationale behind turning mainstreaming into a separate pillar of work of the subsidiary body on the implementation. If mainstreaming is about alignment of national policies, regulations, financial flows and other incentives with the CBD, this work should be at the heart of this SBI. We thus feel the proposal to continue the IAG and its extensive consultative network is ill-considered and would lead to a segregation that is entirely counterproductive to what these bodies were originally set up for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I will continue now with the World Business Council of Sustainable Development, and after that, ICMM. So I give the floor to World Business Council. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm making this statement on behalf of the Business for Nature Coalition. While parties are responsible for the implementation of the post-2020 framework, its objectives cannot be achieved without a meaningful and constructive contribution of business in implementing the framework. The CBD long-term approach on mainstreaming recognizes business and finance as one of the key actors for mainstreaming. However, the current draft framework does not fully integrate them as part of the solution. Mainstreaming biodiversity is a critical condition to achieving the objectives of the framework. Therefore, the framework must promote the mainstreaming of biodiversity, first, into the mandates of all relevant policies, ministries, and finance regulators, and second, into the decision-making core strategies and disclosure of business and financial institutions. We therefore call on parties to include in Annex 1 a recommendation for milestone B2 and target 13 to reflect the 4 parts of society as identified by the Cbd LTEM. Second, a recommendation to provide a clear role for business and financial institutions in the framework, for instance, by improving the current draft targets and developing indicators relevant for business, and by including business plans and commitments in national commitments. A recommendation to mainstream biodiversity into business and financial institutions' decision-making, core strategies, and disclosure by proposing a new target promoting regulatory measures for financial institutions and business to align financial flows to a nature-positive world. We have submitted these proposals also in writing, containing some more specific wording. We remain fully available to all parties to discuss our suggestions further and contribute to a successful outcome. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Business ICMM, and then to FAO, and then after that we need a break. So I give the floor to ICMM. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. ICMM, the International Council on Mining and Metals, is a collaboration between mining companies to enhance the environmental and social contribution of the industry. We support the CBD's efforts to mainstream biodiversity across industry and of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We support promotion of consistent and effective regulation, as is laid out in Action Area 1, but we feel it should also better reflect the need for biodiversity inclusive ESIA and SEA. It should emphasize the role of government in developing and enforcing consistent and cohesive environmental offset policies and mechanisms, and to ensure that offsets and avoidance zones are integrated in protected area laws and approaches. Large transnational companies are especially called out in the approach. Big companies certainly do have a role to play. However, managing the impact of artisanal, small-scale and medium-sized operations also requires specific actions by governments such as regulation, formalisation and capacity building, which should be emphasised. Collaboration with business in strategic land use planning and to achieve greater impact within regions should also be emphasised. Action Area 2 could better reflect the fact that negative impacts in the extractive sector who are tied to a specific location have to be addressed through implementing the mitigation hierarchy, which working towards no net impact, negative impact for an individual site. In this context, working towards no net loss is a significant step forwards, which should be recognised in the indicators and actions separately to net positive impact commitments, which are also important. The action plan provides sector-specific recommendations, such as no net loss for biodiversity impacts in supply chains, landscape approaches for agricultural and other sectors, and integration of GBF goals into policy for mining and other sectors. And this differentiation does not seem justified in our perspective and calls and speaks to the need for more meaningful engagement across different sectors. The suggestions in this statement have been shared in previous drafts with the IAG and are laid out in more detail in our statement.
Thank you. And I can take the intervention of one more observer. Unfortunately, I cannot take more. Then I need to conclude this agenda item, so we can do that before break. So finally, I give the floor to UNFO. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. As delegates will recall, FAO adopted in 2019 the strategy on mainstreaming biodiversity across agricultural sectors. And we are happy to report today that after extensive consultations, the FAO Council adopted at the end of last month an action plan for the implementation of the strategy. The consultations included FAO's committees on fisheries, forestry, and agriculture, as well as FAO's program committee and the group of national focal points for biodiversity for food and agriculture of the Commission on Genetic Resources. The consultations help to increase the awareness of the importance of biodiversity, and the adoption of the strategy and its action plan give evidence of that. FAO welcomes the stabilization and perpetuation of biodiversity mainstreaming. It will be essential that the long-term approach and any action plan parties may decide to adopt are fully synchronized with the Sustainable Development Goals and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We've taken note of the compilation of relevant sources of information and very much agree that the proposition that this document be considered a living document that requires regular updating, including with regard to innovative policies and programs related to sectors affecting biodiversity loss. The FAO strategy and its action plan, as well as the ongoing work of FAO on biodiversity for food and agriculture, will complement and contribute to the global biodiversity framework, as well as to the achievement of the 4 goals that will guide FAO's new strategic framework: better production, better nutrition, a better environment, and a better life. Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair.
Thank you, UNFO. And colleagues, we have now reached the conclusion of our discussion on agenda item 11. I'm sorry, I don't have time to take more interventions from observers. Just for your information, I can tell you that so far the interventions from women, youth, and ICLEI has got some support through the chat by parties. Regarding the way forward, I see that we have a lot of common understanding on the draft recommendations, but also range suggestions for changes regarding the recommendation on mainstreaming. So I will now prepare a conference room papers with the help of the Secretariat. One on the engagements of some national governments, cities, and other local authorities. For the recommendation on mainstreaming, I will consult and advise you on the next steps at our plenary sessions later. So I will, with the help of Secretariat, prepare a conference room paper on some national part of this agenda item, and for the other one, I will consult and come back. So, colleagues, I think we now deserve a break. We will have a 15 minutes break. And please advise me, Secretariat, when we need to be back.
I think we could be back 8:45 Montreal time. So 8:45, 15 minutes, 8:45. Thank you.
8:45. You don't need to log off. So please have a nice break. And after break, we continue with agenda item 5. Thanks. colleagues, welcome back. I hope you have enjoyed your break. And we will now continue with the next agenda item 5. So, distinguished delegates, I now invite you to turn to agenda item 5 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Before I proceed further, I would like to invite the co-leads of a recently convened consultation workshop of biodiversity-related conventions on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Ms. Ann Teller of European Union and Ms. Somali Chan of Cambodia, to provide a short briefing on the outcomes of that consultation. These outcomes are relevant to a post-2020 framework as well as several other items of SBI agenda. And I understood that Ms. Teller will give the briefing, so I give the floor to Ms. Teller, European Union. You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's working this time. Thank you. So yes, indeed. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to debrief the group on the second consultation workshop of biodiversity-related convention on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this workshop, as you know, was convened between 18 January and the 2nd of February in virtual modality mode by UNEP. Of course, we want to thank the government of Switzerland for its generous support. The consultation was set up by 3 video conferencing sessions and an online platform for written comments and submissions to maximize the engagement of other multilateral environmental agreements in the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Contributions were made by the biodiversity, but also chemicals and waste-related conventions and Rio conventions represented by the parties and secretariats. The consultation was led by Somali Chan from the government of Cambodia and myself. It was also supported by UNEP WCMC. The report of the consultation workshop is of high relevance to SBI-3 and has been made available as an information document to the third meeting of the Subsidiary Body on Implementation under INF 29. It's available on the website. In order to facilitate discussions at SBI-3, the executive summary of the report includes a table of conclusions that arose from the synthesis of the workshop discussions and relates them to several agenda items of SBI-3. These comprise Agenda Item 5 that we will discuss now on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, but also Agenda Item 7 on capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, technology transfer, knowledge management and communication. Agenda Item 8 on cooperation with other conventions, international organizations and initiatives. Agenda Item 9 on mechanism for reporting, assessment and review of implementation. Agenda Item 11 that we just discussed on mainstreaming of biodiversity within and across sectors and other strategic actions to enhance implementation. For example, related to Agenda Item 9 on mechanisms for reporting, assessment and review of implementation, it was concluded that national reports and communication to each MEA will necessarily have content that is relevant to assessment of progress in implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Avoiding duplication necessitates a more integrated system for reporting. But any new system will need to build on current tools and processes and use reports that are already there, which may require the use of new tools and approaches, such as the data reporting tool, DART, which could play an important role for streamlining reporting. Also related to Agenda 5, 6, 7, and 8, cooperation and collaboration is not only critical to the cost-effective implementation of MEAs, it's also attractive to donors and is a key part of developing the integrated approach, such as nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based approach that may be necessary for implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This includes identifying opportunities for collaboration in addressing all means of implementation, such as capacity building, resource mobilization, and knowledge management, as well as communication. Related to agenda item on mainstreaming that we just discussed, it was concluded that at the national level, close interaction among the national focal point for the different MEAs is essential for strengthening cooperation and collaboration in implementation. Conducting this in the context of the national mechanism that coordinates actions on the SDGs may provide additional benefits and may be an option for some. Related to agenda item 8 on cooperation with other conventions, international organizations and initiatives, it was concluded that at the national level, close interaction among the national focal point for the different MEAs is essential for strengthening cooperation and collaboration in implementation. Conducting this in the context of a national mechanism that coordinates actions under the DG may also provide benefits. The report also includes a summary prepared by the consultation of the colleagues, Somali and myself, and on our views on the consultation outcomes and the next steps to be taken, including the proposal for an informal Bern-like process, mixing biodiversity-related conventions, other relevant MEAs and relevant international organizations and programs with bureau members from parties to contribute to the UN post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework through a well-defined process with clear roles and responsibilities and agreed matrix. The full report, as well as the background documents, the colleagues' paper and synthesis of contribution can be found at the UNEP Bern 2 website. Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, colleagues, for this very informative briefing. I am sure that delegates will bear these points in mind along with conclusions on the workshop report. Thank you very much. Distinguished delegates, Agenda Item 5 addresses a number of different issues, including the implementation plan and capacity action plan for the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, the gender plan of action for the post-2020 period, proposals for date, venue, and periodicity of upcoming meetings, and the communication plan for the post-2020 period. In the interest of time, we are going to address all these issues together, so I will invite you to make one intervention on these different points. And distinguished delegates, you will recall that earlier in our meeting on Sunday, May 16, we heard a presentation from the co-chairs of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Mrs. Frances Ogwal of Uganda and Mr. Basil Van Nav of Canada, who provided an introduction to the annex contained in Cbd/SBI-3/4. In resuming our consideration of this item, I would now like to invite the Secretariat to introduce the other documents for this item. So, Secretariat, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. The Conference of the Parties, through Decision 1434, established an open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and requested SBI-3 to contribute to the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Subsequently, the working group at its first meeting invited SBI to undertake a set of tasks set out in Annex 1 to its conclusions and to bring to the attention of the working group any additional recommendations relevant to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework emerging from the deliberations at SBI-3. At its second meeting, the working group also invited SBI-3 to provide elements to the development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, in particular with regard to the means to support and review implementation, including implementation support mechanisms, enabling conditions, responsibility, and transparency and outreach and awareness. In light of this, the Secretariat has prepared document CBD/SBI/3/4, which provides an overview of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process. This document also contains a draft recommendation for the consideration of the subsidiary body. This document is supported by two addenda, document 3/4/add1, communications for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as document 3/4/add2/rev1, a draft outline of a post-2020 gender plan of action. Please note that this document has been revised based on submissions received through a consultation process lasting from March 4th to 22nd, 2021. Madam Chair, turning now to the Cartagena Protocol, in its decision CP9/7, the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol decided to develop a follow-up to the protocol strategic plan, a specific implementation plan for the Cartagena Protocol that is anchored in and complementary to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In its decision CP9/3, the meeting of the parties to the protocol acknowledged the need for a specific action plan for capacity building for the implementation of the Cartagena Protocol and its supplementary protocol that is aligned with the implementation plan and complementary to the long-term strategic framework for capacity development beyond 2020. Pursuant to these decisions, the draft implementation plan and capacity building action plan have been developed through an extensive consultative process over the course of 2019 and 2020 and are submitted for consideration by SBI in document CBD/SBI/3/18. The document provides an overview of the development process of the draft implementation plan and capacity building action plan, a description of linkages with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and related processes, as well as suggestions for recommendation. The draft implementation plan and capacity building action plan are contained in the annex to the document, including a joint narrative introduction and a table. The plans are presented alongside one another to show their alignment and complementarity and to avoid duplication. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Secretariat. I will now open the floor for statements on Agenda Item 5 on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. I invite you to focus your interventions on issues related to the development of a post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which have not yet been addressed through other agenda items, as well as on cross-cutting issues related to the Gender Plan of Action, the Communications Plan for the post-2020 period, proposals for date, venue, and periodicity of upcoming meetings, and the Implementation Plan and Capacity Building Action Plan for the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. I would also like to remind you that the working group on Article 8J had made a recommendation on options for possible elements of work aimed at an integration of nature and culture in a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. So I will now open the floor for interventions, starting with regional groups, followed by parties, other governments, and observers. And I encourage you to keep your statement short and concise. So if I ask those who will speak on behalf of regions, I think that for African region, I have on my list here that maybe South Africa will speak for African region. No? Okay. Well, I can start with the European Union on behalf of EU and its member states. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm speaking on behalf of the EU and its member states. And to start, we actually had prepared two interventions, one on the other items and one for the Cartagena Protocol biosafety issues, but I'll start with the first part. We maintain what we said on this item in the informal SBI in March and would like to make the following additional remarks. All parties should fully implement the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. In this regard, we consider the draft post-2020 implementation plan and the capacity building action plan as very good starting points for discussion. For the plans to be efficient and effective and to respond appropriately to relevant COPMOP 9 decisions, they should be separated into two standalone documents to be approved by COPMOP 10. In this way, they can also be adequately anchored in the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and aligned with the long-term strategic framework on capacity building beyond 2020, respectively. The EU and its member states welcome the revised draft outline of a post-2020 gender plan of action. Gender equality is a fundamental human rights concern which needs to be treated as a cross-cutting issue. We support the development of a new gender plan of action to contribute to the implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and encourage all to engage. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by biodiversity loss and by related health crises like the current pandemic. Therefore, we will be happy to contribute to the further development of the post-2020 Gender Plan of Action. The EU and its member states welcome the draft framework for a communication strategy to accompany the Global Biodiversity Framework, and would like to underline that this communication strategy should be seen in the context of the broader discussion on communication, capacity development and knowledge management under the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework discussed under item 7. We consider that the framework for the communication strategy should especially focus on awareness raising and needs for actions by all relevant actors. We would like the Secretariat to confirm our understanding that this complements and does not replace the framework for a communication strategy that was adopted at COP30. The Communication, Education and Public Awareness Informal Advisory Committee should be involved in the implementation, in addition to the flotilla. To ensure this, the mandate of this Informal Advisory Committee should be renewed. Communication is crucial and needs to address the urgency and the ambition needed. They should also target all audiences, all citizens, from public to private. In this context, the EU and its member states would like to draw attention to the global coalition United for Biodiversity, coordinated by the European Commission, with already over 300 participating organizations, zoos, aquariums, botanical gardens, national parks, museums, research centers, and universities from 49 countries. This coalition is building momentum in the run-up to CBD COP15 and beyond. We uploaded some proposals for amendments to the draft recommendation. Let me conclude by reiterating our willingness to continue to work with all parties in view of an ambitious and transformative global biodiversity framework. And let me please ask you for your indulgence to come back at a bit later if we need to add something on the other Cartagena issues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, European Union, speaking on behalf of EU and its member states. I see no more requests from regions. We will now move to interventions from parties. And just as a reminder, if you wish to speak, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, which will turn yellow. Your request will be entered in the queue list. When I give you the floor, your microphone will be activated, the status bar will turn red on your computer, and you may start to speak immediately. So if I can start to give the floor to Malaysia, followed by Indonesia, and then Switzerland. Malaysia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished delegates, Malaysia supports the process undertaken by the Secretariat to finalize the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The new goals, targets, and indicators set will be a guide in the review process of the Malaysia's policy on biological diversity 2016 to 2025. In light of the findings of the 5th Global Biodiversity Outlook, Malaysia holds the view that the full and effective implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework takes precedence. We need to ensure national commitments that are to be adopted at the COP are ambitious but also implementable, reflecting the national circumstances. Malaysia echoes the sentiments for a communication strategy that is clear to enable all other non-governmental stakeholders to be involved in the policy processes. Finally, in recognition that the reporting process is resource-intensive, Malaysia requests continuous financial support from the Secretariat. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Malaysia. And I now give the floor to Indonesia, followed by Switzerland. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Indonesia welcomes the Gender Plan of Action draft, supporting the gender equality in all processes and decision-making in relation to the post-2020 GBF document. Without undermining the role of gender, Indonesia views the sentences in the parentheses on document SBI-3/4/F2-Ref.1, objectives 1.2, 1.3, and 1.4 to be redundant, as the action mentioned in said parentheses are already reflected by the action in each of the objectives opening sentences. We are of the view that this will make the objectives more concise and clear. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Indonesia. I now give the floor to Switzerland, followed by Canada, and then Mexico. Switzerland, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Switzerland records its comments made during the informal SBI meeting in March. In general, we support the draft recommendations contained in document Cbd SBI-3/4. We underline the importance of the following 3 points. We consider the open-ended working group the main process to discuss and finally negotiate the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, including relevant COP decisions and its implementation. We expect that open-ended working group 3 will be the place where the whole package of targets, indicators, and other relevant decisions, such as the review mechanism, action plans, and so on, will be negotiated. We consider a face-to-face third meeting of the open-ended working group a priority, as important decisions on the content of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will have to be discussed and, as far as possible, agreed on. If the sanitary situation will not allow us to travel, we would suggest to opt for virtual or hybrid meetings in order to allow progress in the preparation of COP15. Switzerland would like to highlight once again the importance of integrating the other relevant multilateral environment agreements in these negotiations, in the implementation, in the reporting, and in the stocktake of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we commend the two co-leads for their able chairing of the Bern process. We invite all relevant MEAs to continue to actively engage in this process, to take the floor and share with us their recommendations and how to best integrate the actions as well as the indicators in the processes in order to develop a comprehensive framework. In this regard, I want to insist that item 8, a complex issue with implications on many other agenda items, must be allocated enough time for deliberation. We also would like to invite the chairs of the subsidiary bodies to give the secretariats of the relevant MEAs the floor during our deliberations. We welcome the establishment by the Executive Secretary of a plan concerning the periodicity of the meetings for consideration by COP in order to allow parties to finalize elements needed for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework and to adopt their NBSUPs to the new framework until the next conference of the parties. We give preference to hold COP16 in 2023, and then a 2-year interval has to be used for discussion and work in the subsidiary bodies and other groups to finalize the remaining issues linked to the monitoring framework of the Global Biodiversity Framework and other important issues. Switzerland is of the view that the 2-year interval of COPs is inappropriate and should be maintained. Finally, we would like to flag that COP16 should also be in a position to adopt a coordinated plan of implementation by different bodies, by different groups, ATECs, and other instruments such as work programs, action plans, expert panels, and so on. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Switzerland. I will now give the floor to Canada, followed by Mexico and then UK. Canada, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With regards to the Addendum 1 document on communications for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Canada believes that concerted efforts will be needed to amplify messaging about the importance of biodiversity upon the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Canada notes with regret that this document is not the comprehensive and innovative communication strategy that was requested in Decision 14/34. While we understand that the strategy will have to be further developed based on the final agreed text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we think that this is important to agree on a plan which will guide our communication efforts to promote the new Global Biodiversity Framework. In this context, Canada is of the view that the adoption of a communication strategy must be done in a timely manner in order to leverage the momentum of COP15. As such, we request that the communication strategy be developed by the Secretariat based on the note by the Executive Secretary contained in the Addendum 1 document, as well as the comments made during SBI-3. With regards to the revised Addendum 2 document on the Gender Plan of Action, we regrettably are only able to share our preliminary views at this stage, given the lateness of the document. That being said, we would like to note that Canada strongly supports the Gender Plan of Action as a key element of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We do believe it is important for the objectives and actions identified in the document to remain within the scope of the 3 objectives of the CBD, and that its primary purpose should be to provide the required guidance for parties to implement the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in a gender-responsive manner. In this way, Canada believes that the Gender Plan of Action should help parties integrate gender considerations into the existing implementation mechanisms under the Global Biodiversity Framework. Canada would like to request that a contact group be created to review the wording of the Gender Plan of Action to allow for maximum opportunity for parties and observers to discuss this important document, and we would welcome the support of parties on this proposal. Finally, Canada believes that both addendum documents will be integral parts of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As a result, Canada believes that both documents should be put forward for further negotiation at meetings of the OEWG3 to ensure that they evolve in alignment with the Global Biodiversity Framework. We will be submitting our proposed changes in writing to the Secretariat via the online platform. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada. I will now give the floor to Mexico, followed by UK. Mexico, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mexico made a statement on this topic during the informal sessions. However, we have a few additional comments to make. Firstly, given the importance of awareness raising amongst society, governments, the private sector and other relevant actors as regards the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, as well as the role played by IPLCs, women and youth in this task, we wish to request that the Executive Secretary can develop a communication strategy for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework for consideration by the Open-Ended Working Group and COP15, using the information contained in document SBI-3/4/Add1, since it already marks progress, but it is not yet a finished product. So Mexico supports what has been said by the Government of Canada on that. Then secondly, on the Gender Plan of Action, we have a few comments. First of all, we are pleased to see that suggestions from the peer review process have been included, in particular to have a clear and simple plan of action and to continue with the outcome goal action structure. Secondly, believe that we still need to change the principles, given that they are not drafted as principles and some, in fact, are even confusing. Thirdly, it's also necessary that the outcomes, goals, and the actions of the gender plan should fall within the sphere of competence of our convention. Fourthly, promoting the full and effective participation of women, and in particular Indigenous women, in the development and implementation both of the plan of action and the post-2020 framework is a priority, considering that they are the holders of traditional knowledge associated with the conservation of biodiversity. Now, we have some suggestions on the goals and actions, which we will send to the Secretariat in writing. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mexico. I will now give the floor to UK, followed by Colombia and then Argentina. UK, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Further to the comments we made on item 5 during the informal session, which still stand, we would like to highlight 3 additional points. First, the UK recognises the importance of addressing gender considerations in all aspects of the implementation of the Convention and its protocols. We note the limited time available to review the updated draft outline of the Gender Plan of Action and request that the Secretariat allows additional time for parties and stakeholders to comment. We suggest a reference is included in the SBI Chair's report to reflect this. Second, regarding the communication for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, we agree that communication efforts should include a demonstration of the interlinkages between biodiversity loss, ecosystem degradation, and climate change, and highlight the opportunities presented by synergies. In this regard, we draw attention to the report of the IPBES and IPCC expert workshop on biodiversity and climate change, which is expected to be published shortly. It will also be key to promote the relevance of the framework to actors beyond the traditional biodiversity community, mentoring biodiversity of governments, the private sector, and taking a whole of society approach. This must be fully reflected in the audiences and stakeholders targeted. We believe there is room for more creative thinking here. Third and finally, on the periodicity of meetings of the Conference of the Parties, the UK supports a schedule of meetings that maintains momentum as parties move from agreeing a post-2020 global biodiversity framework to implementing it and reviewing progress. With this in mind, the Conference of the Parties should meet no less than every 2 years, as is currently the case. We have suggested an additional paragraph to the COP decision to reflect this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, UK. And I will now give the floor to Colombia, followed by Argentina and then South Africa. Colombia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We want to thank the Secretariat for the preparation of the communication strategy and the draft gender action plan as a good starting point. However, we have the following comments to strengthen both documents. On the communication strategy, we have first, the strategy is aiming only at raising public awareness, but should also target education and participation according with Article 13 for the Convention, around a greater understanding of the values of biodiversity and of the current biodiversity loss crisis, which the GBF must sort out. Second, this proposal should contribute to the targets 19 and 20 and should aim at a stronger political incidence with the productive sectors for mainstreaming. Third, the scope described in Section 2, Paragraph 4 should not focus only on IPLCs, but should include all stakeholders, such as productive sectors, women, youth, academia, and others. Fourth, Goal should take into account specific messages to specific audiences. Goal C should specifically refer to nature-based solutions. Finally, it is not clear if the flotilla is proposed as an official CBD institutional arrangement. We expect that could be served to promote synergies between MAAs. We will appreciate more guidance in this respect. On the draft gender action plan, we have the following comments. First, the expected outcomes 1 and 2 seem to aim at the same results. We suggest to clarify the difference between these two outcomes. Second, it is important to highlight the need to ensure access, benefits, and participation to women and girls, since they have an enormous add value in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and its ecosystem services, making a special recognition of the role they play in agricultural activities, food security, sustainable diets, education, and replication of traditional knowledge, among others. It is also necessary to evolve from an approach based only on women and girls to more intersectional approach, recognizing that each human being has different characteristics which must be taken into account in this agenda. Finally, the gender plan of the communication strategy should take into account not only communities have internet access, which can limit the effective and equitable participation of these communities. Specific comments for the communication strategy, the draft gender plan, and the Cartagena Protocol implementation plan and capacity building will be provided in writing to the Secretariat. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Colombia. I will now give the floor to Argentina, followed by South Africa and then Brazil. Argentina, you have the floor.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We wish to state once again that when it comes to development of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we're faced with three challenges: implementation, implementation, and more implementation. Thus, in the informal sessions, Argentina highlights that this subsidiary body has a key task to perform in relation to the global framework. However, in the last few weeks of meetings, we've been left with a bittersweet taste in our mouth. Madam Chair, we have to admit it. At times, it seemed as if we were on the path towards adopting a global framework with ambitious conservation, sustainable use, biodiversity targets, but without providing resources in keeping with Article 20, without technology transfer in line with Articles 16, 18 and 19, and without capacity building in accordance with Article 22 of both protocols. We do not want a repeat of history. In order for the framework to be fit for implementation, we have to address the issue of means of implementation in a cross-cutting way for all goals and targets. Likewise, we have to think about enabling conditions, effective communication based on party-agreed messaging, as indicated on topic or item 7 in the agenda, and also solid human rights-based gender responsive approach. So Argentina very much supports the draft gender plan of action as a good starting point. We will send in comments in writing where we will suggest strengthening the document in terms of human rights, introducing a gender perspective and an inclusive language in the drafting thereof, and incorporating a diversity lens with regards LGBTI plus people. Likewise, we recommend broadening various aspects of the goals. Dear delegates, we challenge you to think of the global framework in a way that goes beyond just goals and targets. We have to envisage it as a package which includes the Kunming action targets, means to implement it, and the enabling conditions. The planetary biodiversity situation is alarming. We need a global framework that is not just words on a page. Argentina is calling on all parties, especially those that are developed countries, to commit to this. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Argentina. I will now give the floor to South Africa, followed by Brazil and then Portugal. South Africa, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. South Africa is concerned with the lack of priority according to the Biodiversity Protocol. The fact that the discussion under the implementation plan does not have a standalone agenda is enshadowed by the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is a practical example that the Biodiversity Protocol is being marginalized under the Convention. Madam Chair, South Africa also support the Africa Group statement made during the informal session of the SBI, wherein they requested to separate the two plans. Therefore, we would like to request the Executive Secretary to separate the two documents for consideration and adoption by parties at COPMOP 10 as a separate document. Madam Chair, it is also evident from the analysis for the fourth assessment and review of the Cartagena Protocol and its final evaluation of the strategic plan that a transformative change approach is required for the effective implementation of the Biosafety Protocol. Therefore, South Africa would like to propose that the structure of the implementation plan follow the same format as that one of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The implementation plan should respond to a specific goal of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It should also be built around a theory of change supported by tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming, enabling conditions and adequate means of implementation, including commensurate financial resources, capacity building, and technology transfer. The implementation plan needs to reflect appropriate recognition of gender equality, women empowerment, youth, gender-responsive approaches, and the full and effective participation of IPLC. In light of our reflection above, we would like to suggest that the Executive Secretary restructure the implementation plan to take the same format of the GBF. Madam Chair, we have also submitted our textual changes on the suggested recommendation for your consideration, which include a specific request to the Global Environment Facility to support parties in the implementation efforts under the implementation plan. In response to your request for additional points linked to the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework, we would like to note that, like the previous agenda item 11 on action plan for long-term approach to mainstreaming biodiversity, that there is a lot of value in developing action plans and request that other such action plans be developed to support the implementation of the GBF. Recalling the lack of progress towards Aichi Target 12, we acknowledge the work that has been initiated by the IUCN to develop a global species action plan to support governments and other stakeholders to achieve their species components in the GBF. We request the co-chairs of the OEWG to recognize these initiatives, noting that parties will have an opportunity to review the value of a first version of this plan, which will be made available as an info document to OEWG3. Thank you.
Thank you, South Africa. I will now give the floor to Brazil, followed by Portugal and Australia. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It is a pleasure to see you again. During the informal session, we had the chance to present comments to document Cbd SBI-3/18 on the draft implementation plan and the capacity building action plan for the Cartagena Protocol. Those comments still stand, and we will submit written comments with specific text proposals. In this regard, we would like to emphasize once again that the voluntary nature of obligations set within Article 23 on public consultation and Article 26 on socioeconomic considerations should be explicitly mentioned in the corresponding goals, objectives, and indicators of the implementation plan. Regarding goals and objectives about risk management, the respective indicators should also include an indicator on cooperation among parties in order to strengthen the implementation of Article 16, Paragraph 5 of the Protocol. We would also like to express our concern on the reference to national checklists in the capacity-building activities, as previous decisions under the Protocol have not addressed or endorsed recommendations on checklists, and capacity-building initiatives must be developed on a demand-driven basis. Regarding document SBI-3/4 Ed 1, on the communications for the post-2020 GBF, as we had the chance to state under Agenda Item 7, from Brazil's perspective, an effective communication strategy for the post-2020 GBF needs to resonate with all parties, IPRCs, and stakeholders. That being so, we would like to express our deep concern on the uptake of concepts that lack a multilaterally agreed definition, such as nature-based solutions, and prejudge the best way to promote synergies among MEAs. Such concepts should be debated from the documents. More, we should engage with specific communication initiatives that have limited participation among parties, and therefore might not reflect a comprehensive and balanced approach to the communication priorities for the post-2020 GBF and the different visions of parties. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Brazil. And I now give the floor to Portugal and then Australia. Portugal, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Distinguished delegates, I'm speaking on behalf of the European Union and its member states. We would like to complement our previous statement. Chair, as mentioned previously, the EU and its member states remain strongly in favor of separating the implementation plan and the capacity building action plan for the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety and its supplementary protocol in two standalone documents. The EU and its member states consider capacity building highly important and key for a successful implementation of the Cartagena Protocol. Thus, the capacity building action plan needs to be comprehensive and to serve as a basis for successful capacity building activities. Therefore, we suggest some amendments so that the action plan can be individually read and referenced and effectively put in practice. While we suggest to keep the overall structure and goals, we added some additional key areas and activities that we believe are important for the successful implementation of the Cartagena Protocol. They should be considered as suggestions since the aim is a plan adaptable to each party's context and needs. We further included specific indicators to measure the success of the capacity building activities. Additionally, several outcomes were added to describe in more detail the expected results from each activity, as well as a non-exhaustive indicative list of possible actors and target groups involved in the development of each activity. For example, the engagement of academia with government agencies is, in our view, beneficial for stronger capacity building in the areas covered by the Cartagena Protocol. Let me conclude by reiterating our willingness to continue working closely with all of you towards the full implementation of the Cartagena Protocol and its supplementary protocol. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Portugal. I will now give the floor to Australia, followed by Chile. Australia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Australia would like to note the lateness of the revised Addendum 2 paper has meant insufficient time for parties to consult domestically. In future, Australia would ask the Secretariat to allow parties sufficient time to consider our positions. Australia supports Canada in asking that the Chair's report reflects our desire to have an updated Gender Plan of Action made available for consideration by parties at Open-Ended Working Group 3, and for the Chair to open a contact group for this document. In order to be effective, strong buy-in from parties is required, and we note that only 11 parties provided submissions in the last peer review process. The Gender Plan of Action would benefit from a collective analysis and discussion by parties. If this isn't possible, we would ask that another peer review process be undertaken prior to Open-Ended Working Group 3. With regard to the draft COP decision, we propose strengthening the text by replacing "to help implement" with as a tool for all parties and relevant stakeholders in implementing. This is to reflect the importance of the Gender Plan of Action for implementing gender considerations across the entire GBF, rather than focusing on specific elements. Australia notes the intent of not including specific references to Indigenous and rural women and girls in the draft outline. However, Indigenous women and girls have different experiences and face different challenges, thus should be referenced in all drafts of this document. Lastly, the paper references that special provisions will be made in the final plan to support the effective engagement and address the needs of Indigenous and rural women and girls. Australia would suggest the Secretariat make clear what these provisions are in all drafts of the Gender Plan of Action to ensure effective domestic consultation on proposed provisions. We have some suggestions on the draft Gender Plan of Action and will submit them in writing to the Secretariat. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Australia. And finally, on my list of parties, Chile. You have the floor. Chile, you have the floor.
De contar con un plan de género actualizado para la implementación del
It's very good to have an updated plan for GBF post 2020, and we support the document, but we need to reinforce it and have more inclusive language. And we also support the fact that there should be a working group on this subject. So we support the idea of setting up a working group on this subject, and we're available to work in that. We've got a brief comment on the communication strategy. We think it's very important to work on this becoming an effective plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chile. Very brief. And I give the floor to Peru. You have the floor.
El plan de acción de género, mi delegación.
On the Gender Plan of Action, we'd like to underline the importance of having voluntary guidelines on responsible governance for landholders and for fisheries and forestry within the context of food security. Participation of women and having equal access to economic resources is important, and we need to research the threats against human rights women defenders. And we need to have a secure environment that allows them to defend human rights and have practical, effective measures that can protect this gender-based approach so that it can create opportunities to generate high quality income. And there can be specific measures to promote specialized knowledge and the participation of women in activities related to the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. We are very happy to have a distribution of activities and have capacity building activities as part of the budget with a gender-based budget, so that we can promote gender-responsive policies to support these actions for adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Finally, Peru considers that it's a priority to strengthen financial and technical support that should be made available to have better mainstreaming of gender issues in the policies and strategies and measures for the conservation of biodiversity and sustainable use thereof, taking account of the fact that we need to have a transparent process. We agree with what Switzerland has said, and we will certainly support that statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Peru. And I recognize Malawi. Malawi, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We support the Gender Plan of Action and would like to highlight its importance for the implementation of the post-2020 biodiversity strategy. We would like to support Canada on the need to discuss this further in a contact group so that we can develop relevant indicators, as well as it's very important in terms of looking at issues of capacity building. So more time would really require to finalize what is needed to complete the Gender Plan of Action. With regards to communication, we note that there are two phases of communication desired: communication during the process of development of the post-2020 framework and communication after the post-2020 framework has been developed. So with this regard, we would like to highlight that timing is very important so that we are able to support the development process with communication outcomes, as well as the uptake after it has been developed. So we'll submit our recommendations with regards to communication in writing that responds to the two different phases to increase our chances of uptake of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, and also be able to develop a framework that is easy to communicate after it has been developed. Thank you.
Thank you, Malawi. I see no more requests from parties. So I see if there are any requests from other governments. No. I would now like to open the floor for interventions by representatives of major groups or stakeholders. And I think we cannot conclude this agenda item today. I will give the floor to IPLCs, and then I need to end this session today. We will continue with the item 5 tomorrow and take some few